The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan was an ocean of wealth and grandeur. The warm glow from the crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a golden light that reflected off the marble floors and glass-top tables. Every corner of the Grand Hall was occupied by the most influential figures of New York. CEOs, politicians, celebrities, all gathered for the annual charity gala hosted by none other than Alexander Vaughn. Known for his empire in the tech industry, Alexander was revered and envied, his every move scrutinized by those who wished to follow in his footsteps. He stood at the center of attention, perfectly composed in a custom-made suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and lean frame. His eyes, an icy blue that could pierce through a boardroom full of dissenting voices, swept across the room. Sarah Vaughn, his wife, stood by his side, her smile as poised as it was practiced. With her elegant navy gown and a small sapphire pendant that matched her deep, thoughtful eyes, she looked every bit the queen of this modern empire. Her hand rested protectively over her rounded belly, a subtle reminder of the new chapter waiting just a couple of months ahead. The room buzzed with chatter, punctuated by clinking glasses and bursts of laughter. Yet, despite the jovial facade, Sarah sensed the undercurrent of tension emanating from Alexander. He had always been ambitious, relentless even, but tonight something in his demeanor felt different, sharper, more restless. As she took a sip from her sparkling water, she noticed his gaze fixed on a point across the room. Following it, she saw her, Isabel Martinez. Isabel, with her long dark hair swept to one side and wearing a striking red dress that clung to her figure, was an embodiment of allure and confidence. A former model turned fashion entrepreneur, she was someone whose very presence could shift the atmosphere. And tonight, she held Alexander's attention like a moth drawn to flame. Sarah's breath hitched, the room seeming to close in around her. She had heard whispers before, fragmented truths buried under layers of denials and excuses. But seeing it, the undeniable pull between them, twisted a knife she didn't know she still carried. The MC's voice boomed through the speakers, calling for the attention of the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats as we begin the auction." The crowd complied, eager to outbid each other for charity items that were as extravagant as the event itself. Alexander stepped forward to the podium, his movements assured and deliberate. "Tonight," he began, his voice resonant and confident, "we come together not just to celebrate, but to make a difference." The crowd listened, captivated as always. "And tonight, I feel especially motivated, inspired." He paused, his gaze cutting through the distance and landing squarely on Isabel. "By someone who reminds us all of passion and ambition." "Isabel?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The chatter that followed was a blend of confusion and shock, like static crackling in the silence. Sarah's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, the delicate material protesting under the pressure. Her vision blurred as she forced herself to keep standing, to keep breathing. Alexander continued, oblivious or indifferent to the scandal brewing among his guests. He lifted his glass in a toast, but before he could say another word, Sarah's voice, soft yet resonant, cut through the noise. "Excuse me," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, before turning on her heel and making her way out of the ballroom. The eyes of Manhattan's elite tracked her every move as she walked, spine straight, tears threatening to spill but kept at bay by sheer willpower. The weight of betrayal crushed her, and each step felt like walking on shards of glass. The murmurs behind her turned into an indistinguishable roar as she reached the grand entrance and pushed the doors open, the cold night air slapping her cheeks. Outside, the streets of Manhattan were a blur of neon lights and endless traffic, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the confines of the hotel. She hailed a cab, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When she settled into the back seat, the driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, eyes laced with curiosity and concern. But Sarah looked away, unable to meet the reflection of her own shattered image. Back in the ballroom, Alexander stood motionless at the podium. The silence that had gripped the room morphed into uneasy whispers. Isabel stepped forward, her smile unfaltering as she reached out to touch Alexander's arm. "It had to be done," she whispered, her voice just for him. He flinched, the touch now feeling foreign, wrong. The faces around him no longer wore expressions of admiration. Instead, there was judgment, betrayal, and for the first time, pity. Alexander's chest tightened as the realization washed over him. He had gained nothing. In a room full of power and prestige, he had managed to make himself the most alone. And there, under the blinding chandelier light, the fall of Alexander Vaughn began. 3 years had passed since that night in Manhattan, a night that etched itself into Sarah's memory like a wound that refused to heal. The world she once knew, the glittering galas, the whispers of high society, the cold touch of betrayal, was a ghost she left behind. Now, Cape Cod was her sanctuary, a world apart from the relentless hum of New York City. The coastal town, with its rolling dunes and crisp sea air, offered a quiet that was both soothing and unsettling. Sarah stood on the porch of her quaint, whitewashed cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. The rhythmic crash of the waves was a lullaby she had come to rely on, a reminder that life moved forward, no matter how deep the wounds. Inside, the sound of tiny feet pattering against the wooden floor made her smile. Ethan, now a spirited 2-year-old with his father's striking blue eyes, bounded into view, a toy truck clutched in his small hands. "Mama!" he called, his voice a burst of joy that melted the remnants of tension clinging to her. Sarah bent down, scooping him up and inhaling the sweet scent of childhood, warm milk and soap. He giggled as she spun him around, the sound like music against the backdrop of the evening. "Time for bed soon, little one," Sarah said, pressing a kiss to his temple. Ethan squirmed in her arms, already resisting the idea of sleep. It was moments like these that filled the emptiness Alexander's betrayal left behind. Yet there were still nights when the memories clawed their way back, vivid and sharp. "Need help?" Maggie's voice broke through Sarah's reverie. Her best friend and confidant, Maggie was a beacon of light in the tumultuous aftermath of Sarah's departure from New York. A nurse by profession and fiercely loyal by nature, Maggie had been by Sarah's side through every sleepless night and silent tear. "I think I've got this one," Sarah replied, smiling at the woman who had become as close as a sister. Maggie chuckled and walked over to tousle Ethan's hair, earning a delighted squeal from him. "Bedtime stories again?" Maggie teased, her eyes warm. She knew that those stories were as much for Sarah as they were for Ethan, a way to reassure both mother and son that their new life was built on love, not the ghosts of the past. As the sun dipped lower, the cottage filled with the soft glow of lamps and the scent of lavender tea. Sarah sat in the nursery, reading aloud from a worn picture book, while Ethan's eyelids grew heavier until they finally closed. She watched his chest rise and fall, peace etched across his tiny features. He was her anchor, the tangible proof that not all remnants of her past with Alexander were tainted. But Cape Cod was not a place that hid one forever. Even as she held onto her sanctuary, whispers from Manhattan occasionally found their way to her doorstep. Rumors of Alexander's failing empire, stories of his volatile relationship with Isabel that played out in tabloid headlines, all painted a picture of a man unraveling. Sarah pushed those thoughts away, refusing to let the shadows of what once was seep into the walls of her new life. Yet fate had its own plans. On a stormy afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the cracks, the phone rang. Its shrill cry sliced through the otherwise tranquil house, startling Sarah as she wiped down the kitchen counter. She hesitated, staring at the blinking light. Most calls were from Maggie or local friends, but there was something in the air that made her chest tighten with a premonition she didn't understand. "Hello?" Sarah's voice was steady, though her fingers clutched the receiver tighter than usual. "Sarah, it's Maggie." The tremor in her friend's voice was unmistakable, setting off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. "I need you to sit down." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's knees weakened, and she sank into the nearest chair, her heart pounding wildly. "What is it? What's wrong?" Her mind raced to Ethan, to every worst-case scenario it could conjure. "It's not you or Ethan," Maggie said quickly, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. A heavy pause, then, It's Alexander. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, a name she had trained herself not to say out loud, not to even think about more than necessary. What happened? The question came out quieter than she intended. He's here, in Cape Cod. He's at the hospital. I don't know everything, but you need to know. I thought you should hear it from me first. The room spun, the storm outside matching the chaos inside her chest. Alexander, here? The walls she had built around her heart threatened to crumble. Memories, both cherished and cursed, flooded back. The touch of his hand, the way his voice could shift from warmth to ice, the night he broke everything. They all surged forward, demanding her attention. But there, on the edge of it all, was the echo of something Maggie had once told her. Words that now seemed to resonate in the storm. Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you. The next morning, the storm had blown through, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky and the scent of wet earth. Sarah stood by the window, gazing at the glistening leaves and the way the sunlight caught the drops that clung to them. She hadn't slept. The news from Maggie had replayed in her mind all night, refusing to let her find rest. Alexander was in Cape Cod, at the hospital. The past, which she had worked so hard to bury, had clawed its way back into her life. The sound of Ethan stirring in his room brought her back to the present. His morning babble, soft and innocent, was a balm for her frayed nerves. She forced a smile as she walked into his room, his bright eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Good morning, my love," she whispered, scooping him into her arms. He giggled, the sound pure and untouched by the worries that gnawed at her. As she dressed him and prepared breakfast, Sarah tried to push the thought of Alexander aside, focusing on the simple, beautiful routine of their life. But Maggie's call echoed in her mind, each word a thorn. He's here, in Cape Cod. The phrase had the power to erode every ounce of stability Sarah had built for herself and Ethan. It was only when Maggie knocked at her door later that morning that reality truly set in. Sarah opened the door to find Maggie standing there, eyes red from lack of sleep and concern etched across her face. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her presence both comforting and alarming. "I came as soon as I could," Maggie said, pulling Sarah into a hug. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them speaking louder than words. Finally, Maggie pulled back, her expression serious. "I need to tell you more about Alexander." Sarah's stomach churned. "I don't want to know," she said, turning away. But Maggie caught her wrist gently. "You need to hear this, Sarah. He's here because of you." Sarah froze, the weight of those words crashing down on her. "Because of me?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Maggie nodded. "From what I gathered, he's been searching for you for months. Things went downhill for him after you left. The tabloids only told half the story. Isabel left him, and his company is barely holding on. He's changed, Sarah. I saw him at the hospital when I was on shift. He's not the man he used to be." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to process everything. A part of her, the part still wounded from that night 3 years ago, wanted to feel vindicated. But another part, quieter and harder to ignore, felt something else, an ache she thought she'd buried long ago. "I don't know if I can face him," she admitted, her voice trembling. Maggie placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just know that he's here, and he's asking to see you." The day passed in a blur, each hour dragging under the weight of indecision. When evening came, Sarah sat on the porch, the ocean before her calm and endless. She replayed the past in her mind, the way Alexander had looked at her when they first met, how his ambition had been intoxicating and magnetic, how that same ambition had pulled them apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. Ethan toddled out, his chubby hands grasping the edges of her dress as he leaned into her. "Story, Mama?" he asked, looking up with eyes that mirrored the very man who haunted her thoughts. She nodded, lifting him into her lap and holding him close. The story she told was soft and simple, about a ship that braved a storm and found its way to a safe harbor. But her voice faltered as she thought of Alexander, a man who had once been the center of her world, now reduced to whispers and shadows. The knock at the door was both sudden and inevitable. Sarah stiffened, holding Ethan tighter as Maggie, who had stayed for dinner, glanced at her with questioning eyes. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of waves. Finally, with a deep breath, Sarah stood, handing Ethan to Maggie. "Stay here," she whispered, and walked toward the door. Every step was a battle, a clash between her past and present. She opened the door, and there he was. Alexander stood on the other side, no longer the polished man who commanded boardrooms and dominated headlines. His face was drawn, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something more, regret. The lines that had deepened around his mouth and the slight stoop in his shoulders told her everything words never could. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, raw and stripped of pretense. For a moment, neither spoke. The distance between them was more than the few feet of her threshold. It was a chasm carved by betrayal, loss, and time. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted, the vulnerability in his tone disarming her defenses. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. There he was, the man who had once been her everything, standing before her, broken. And she had to decide whether to close the door on him or invite the storm back into her life. Sarah stood at the threshold, her grip on the doorknob tightening as Alexander's gaze met hers. For a long moment, time seemed suspended, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore the only noise breaking the silence. The memories that flooded her mind were relentless, dragging her back to a time when love was easy and promises were kept. But those days were buried beneath the pain of betrayal. "Can I come in?" Alexander's voice was low, hesitant. The confident man who once commanded entire rooms with a single look now seemed unsure of his place, unsure of her. Sarah's instinct was to slam the door and retreat to the safety of her carefully constructed life. But something in the depths of his eyes, a plea wrapped in regret, kept her rooted to the spot. With a deep breath, she stepped aside, allowing him entry. Alexander walked in slowly, taking in the warmth of the small home. It was a stark contrast to the grand spaces he was used to. Instead of sleek, cold lines and polished surfaces, there were toys scattered on the floor, a vase of fresh wildflowers on the table, and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. It felt lived in, loved. Everything their penthouse in Manhattan had never been. Maggie appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, Ethan in her arms. The toddler looked curiously at the man standing in their home, and Alexander's breath caught as he took in the child's eyes, his eyes. The resemblance was uncanny, a mirror to the past and a reminder of all that he had missed. "Hello," Maggie said stiffly, her eyes narrowing at Alexander before she glanced at Sarah for direction. Sarah nodded subtly, and Maggie turned back to Ethan. "Come on, little one. Let's go find your favorite book." Ethan giggled, blissfully unaware of the tension that filled the room, and Maggie disappeared into the back, leaving Sarah and Alexander alone. "Sit, if you'd like," Sarah said, motioning to the worn couch. Her voice was calm, controlled, though her heart thudded against her ribs. Alexander sat down, his movements slow, as if the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for one of them to break the silence. "I know I have no right to be here," Alexander began, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He looked older, more worn than Sarah remembered. "But I needed to see you." To see him. Sarah's eyes flickered to the hallway where Maggie and Ethan had disappeared. "Why now, Alexander? After all this time?" He sighed, a sound that carried the burden of regret. "Everything fell apart after you left. I thought I could rebuild, that I could make something meaningful out of the mess I created, but I was wrong." His voice cracked, and he looked away, ashamed. "I lost everything, Sarah. The company, my reputation. Isabel left, and the empire I sacrificed everything for turned to ashes." The bitterness in his voice struck a chord deep within her. She had once known that voice when it spoke words of love and ambition, not remorse and despair. She crossed her arms, a protective gesture. "You sacrificed us, Alexander. For what? For ambition? For a fleeting promise of something more?" "I know," he whispered. eyes glistening with a pain that seemed almost foreign on his usually composed face. "I made choices I can't take back, but being here, seeing you, seeing Ethan." His voice caught, and he exhaled shakily. "It makes me realize how much I've truly lost." Sarah felt a familiar ache spread through her chest, the crack in her resolve widening. He was right. He couldn't take back what he had done. The past was a series of irreversible choices, each one a brick in the wall that now stood between them. "Ethan is my world now," she said, her voice steady but softening. "He deserves a life without the chaos you bring." "I know," Alexander said again, this time with a determination that surprised her. He stood up slowly, looking down at her with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything, really. I just needed you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." Before she could respond, the sound of Ethan's laughter floated from the hallway, breaking the tension that had gripped the room. Alexander's eyes flickered with longing, a father's instinct buried under years of neglect and guilt. Maggie reappeared with Ethan, who spotted Sarah and squirmed out of Maggie's arms. He ran toward his mother, his tiny arms outstretched, and Sarah scooped him up, holding him close. Alexander watched, his expression softening as Ethan looked at him with wide, curious eyes. "Who dat, Mama?" Ethan asked, pointing a chubby finger at Alexander. Sarah's throat tightened, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. The past and present collided, an inevitable meeting she had dreaded and longed for in equal measure. "That's," she began, glancing at Alexander, who held his breath, waiting for her answer. "That's someone we used to know, sweetheart." Alexander's face fell slightly, but he nodded, understanding that trust and forgiveness were not granted but earned. And as he looked at his son for the first time, really looked at him, he knew this was just the beginning of a long road he was willing to take, step by painful step. The days that followed Alexander's arrival were a blur of conflicted emotions for Sarah. Each morning, she woke with a mixture of exhaustion and anxiety, the knowledge that Alexander was in Cape Cod gnawing at her. Yet, there was also something else, something more confusing that she didn't want to name. It was the pull of memories, the echo of better times, moments when love and laughter had been abundant, before ambition poisoned everything. Alexander had kept his word. He didn't press her for more than she was willing to give. He visited the local coffee shop, took long walks by the shore, and sometimes sat quietly at the park where he could catch glimpses of Ethan playing. He never approached but always watched with a longing that tugged at Sarah's heart. Maggie, as always, was a steady presence. "Are you really okay?" she asked one afternoon as they sipped iced tea on the porch. The breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, a constant reminder of the life Sarah had built here. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, staring out at the gentle waves. "Part of me is furious that he's here, that he has the nerve to think he can come back after everything. But another part," she trailed off, biting her lip, "another part remembers when he was different," Maggie finished for her, her voice soft with understanding. Sarah nodded. "Yes, and seeing him now, broken and remorseful, it's hard to ignore. Just make sure you're thinking about what's best for you and Ethan," Maggie advised. "Not the Alexander you remember, but the one standing here now." That evening, as the sun cast long, golden rays over the quiet town, Sarah took Ethan for a walk along the beach. He babbled happily, chasing seagulls and giggling when the waves tickled his toes. Sarah watched him, heart swelling with a mixture of love and worry. How would she explain his father to him? How could she balance the need for boundaries with the reality of Alexander's presence? Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice Alexander approaching from the other side of the beach until he was a few yards away. He stopped, his eyes taking in the scene before him with an expression that was unreadable but intense. Ethan noticed him too, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Hi there," Alexander said, his voice gentle, as if not to startle either of them. Ethan looked up at his mother, seeking permission. Sarah's chest tightened, but she nodded, a silent encouragement that made Ethan's face light up. "Hi," Ethan chirped, his voice clear and bright. He stepped closer to Alexander, who knelt down, I level with his son for the first time. Do you like the beach? Alexander asked, his voice trembling slightly. It was an innocent question, yet loaded with meaning. Yeah, Ethan exclaimed, pointing at a sandcastle he had been working on. I made that. Alexander's gaze shifted to the uneven pile of sand, a child's masterpiece. He smiled, a genuine, heart-wrenching smile that softened the harsh lines of his face. It's amazing, he said, coloring his tone. You're quite the builder. Sarah stood back, watching the tentative interaction with emotions she couldn't name. Alexander's eyes flicked up to hers for a brief moment, gratitude evident in their depths, before focusing back on Ethan. Ethan's chatter continued, undeterred by the newness of Alexander's presence. He was too young to understand the complexities, too innocent to feel the weight that surrounded the adults. Alexander, for his part, seemed content just to listen, to soak in every detail of this moment that he'd never thought he'd have. The sun dipped lower, casting the beach in hues of orange and pink. Alexander rose slowly, brushing sand from his pants. I should go, he said, his voice reluctant. Before he could turn away, Ethan reached out, placing a tiny hand on Alexander's. Will you come back? The question hung in the air, a simple request from a child that cut through layers of silence and hesitation. Alexander looked at Sarah, the unspoken question passing between them. She nodded, just once, and it was enough. Yes, Alexander said, his voice firm. I'll be back. As he walked away, Sarah watched him with a heart that was no longer just angry or just forgiving, but something in between. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, the possibility of something other than pain flickered on the horizon. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the boundaries between the past and present grew blurrier. Alexander's presence, initially an unwelcome reminder of betrayal, began to transform into something different, an opportunity, perhaps, for understanding. He kept his visits to the beach, where Ethan would wait eagerly, holding a bucket or a small shovel. Sarah often watched from a distance, her heart tangled in a web of hope, fear, and a nagging voice that questioned if it was all an illusion. One afternoon, as a warm breeze swept through the town, Alexander arrived at the beach carrying a kite. Its bright colors fluttered in the wind, drawing Ethan's attention immediately. The boy's eyes widened, and he ran to Alexander, giggling with excitement. Look, Mama, Ethan called, waving the kite above his head. Sarah waved back, the smile on her face more genuine than she'd felt in a long time. She watched as Alexander showed Ethan how to hold the string, his hands steady and patient. Hold it tight, Alexander said, his voice filled with a softness that resonated with the wind. He let the string go, and the kite soared into the sky, dancing against the backdrop of a perfect blue. Look, it's flying, Ethan shouted, his joy infectious. Sarah felt Maggie's presence beside her. He's good with him, Maggie said, crossing her arms as she watched. I didn't expect that. Neither did I, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But it was true. The Alexander she remembered had always been consumed by deadlines, meetings, and achievements. This version of him, standing barefoot on the sand, eyes crinkled with genuine happiness as he shared a moment with his son, was almost unrecognizable. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the beach, Alexander walked over to Sarah, Ethan perched on his hip, chattering about how high the kite had flown. The sight was jarring, father and son, a picture of what could have been. Can we talk? Alexander asked, shifting Ethan gently back to the ground. The boy scampered off to chase the waves, leaving them alone. Sarah nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. They walked a little way down the shore, the waves lapping at their feet. Silence lingered, punctuated only by the calls of distant seagulls. I know this doesn't fix anything, Alexander began, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I know that one good day doesn't erase years of pain. But I want to be honest with you, Sarah. I need you to know that losing you, losing everything, changed me in ways I can't fully explain. His voice carried a sincerity that reached past her defenses. Sarah's chest tightened. I've spent so long trying to move on, To create a world for Ethan that doesn't include betrayal or disappointment, she said, turning to face him. And now you're here, wanting a second chance when I'm not sure I have anything left to give. Alexander's expression was one of raw vulnerability. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve it, but I want to be here for him, for you, in whatever way you'll let me. The breeze tugged at Sarah's hair as she looked into those familiar blue eyes. For years, they had represented a dream that turned into a nightmare. Now, they reflected something she hadn't seen in a long time: genuine remorse. I need time, Sarah said, her voice firm but wavering with emotion. Time to understand what any of this means, to see if we can rebuild anything at all. Alexander nodded, accepting her words with quiet resignation. I'll be here, as long as it takes. They stood there, the sea stretching endlessly before them, and for the first time, the distance between them didn't feel insurmountable. The horizon held a glimmer of possibility, fragile yet real. The sound of Ethan's laughter reached them, and they both turned to watch him leap over the foam-tipped waves. Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek, one of bittersweet relief. Maybe, just maybe, the path ahead wouldn't be as dark as she feared. As the sun dipped below the edge of the world, the sky ablaze with colors of hope, Alexander took a step back, giving Sarah the space she needed. And for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to shut the door completely. There was still pain, still mistrust, but there was also the faint, tentative outline of a new beginning. The weeks that followed were marked by small, cautious steps. Alexander made an effort to build a bridge between the man he was and the man he was trying to become. He showed up regularly, helping Sarah with small tasks around the house, offering to cook meals, and spending time with Ethan, who now seemed to anticipate his father's visits with an excitement that tugged at Sarah's heart. It was an unfamiliar rhythm, one where the past and present coexisted in an uneasy balance. One morning, as the town's weekly farmers' market buzzed with life, Sarah decided to take Ethan out, needing a distraction from the relentless questions swirling in her mind. She walked down the cobblestone path, lined with stalls brimming with fresh produce, handmade crafts, and the sweet scent of baked goods. Ethan's hand held tightly in hers. They stopped at a stall selling honey and jams. He pointed eagerly at a jar of bright orange marmalade, and she smiled, ruffling his hair. "Can we get it, Mama?" Ethan asked, eyes wide with anticipation. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied, reaching into her bag. "Let me," a familiar voice said. Sarah turned sharply to see Alexander standing behind them, a gentle smile on his face as he handed money to the vendor. The stall owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, looked between them and offered a knowing smile, the kind that seemed to see more than just the present moment. "Thank you," Sarah said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. It was an acknowledgement of his efforts, a subtle shift from the guardedness that had defined her interactions with him. They walked through the market together, Alexander occasionally lifting Ethan onto his shoulders to give him a better view. Sarah watched them, a lump forming in her throat. The sight was a glimpse into an alternate reality, one where betrayal hadn't severed their lives. It was painfully beautiful and achingly bittersweet. They reached the end of the market where a small band played light, cheerful music. Couples danced, children chased each other, and the sun shone down with a warmth that felt almost out of place. Alexander set Ethan down, who immediately ran to join the other kids. "Sarah," Alexander said, turning to her. The music played on, a soundtrack to a conversation she knew was coming. "Can we talk for a minute?" She hesitated but then nodded, folding her arms as if to shield herself from the emotions threatening to surface. "I know I've said this before, but I need you to understand that leaving everything behind to come here, it wasn't just about Ethan. It was about you, too," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with vulnerability. "Every day since that night in Manhattan, I've regretted what I did. I was blinded by ambition, by a need to prove something to myself, and I lost sight of the only things that truly mattered." The words hung between them, heavy and real. Sarah looked down, the cobblestones under her feet blurring as memories flooded back. The laughter they once shared, the whispered dreams in the dark, and the shattering moment when it all fell apart. But regret isn't enough, Alexander, she said, her voice cracking as she met his gaze. It doesn't erase the hurt or fix what's broken. I know, he said, taking a small step closer. But maybe it's a start. I want to be here, even if it's just as someone who helps you rebuild what I broke. Sarah searched his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was the truth. A man who was trying to atone, who was willing to do the hard work of earning back trust, no matter how long it took. The walls she had built were strong, but even they couldn't ignore the relentless battering of time and effort. Before she could respond, Ethan's laughter rang out as he ran toward them, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. He held up a small flower he had picked, offering it to Sarah. "For you, Mama." She took it with a smile, the simple gesture making her eyes well up. Ethan turned and handed another one to Alexander, who knelt down to accept it, his expression softening with gratitude. "Thank you, buddy," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan giggled and dashed back to his friends, leaving his parents standing in the sun, holding the fragile blooms that felt like symbols of something delicate and new. Sarah took a deep breath. Maybe we can try to find a way forward, but it will take time." Alexander nodded, hope flickering in his eyes. "Time is all I ask for." The music swelled around them, the lively notes wrapping them in a moment that felt impossibly fragile and full of promise. As they stood side by side, not quite reconciled but not entirely apart, the future felt like a path worth exploring, step by tentative step. Summer melted into the crisp embrace of autumn, painting Cape Cod in warm hues of amber and gold. The days grew shorter, but each one brought a subtle shift that Sarah could feel in her bones. Alexander continued to be a steady presence, showing up not just for Ethan, but for her. The bridge between them, once shattered and splintered, was slowly being rebuilt, plank by plank. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the past would surge up like an angry wave, threatening to drown Sarah in memories that stung like salt on an open wound. But then there were other moments of laughter, shared glances, and quiet conversations that made her wonder if the storm might eventually calm for good. One cool evening, the three of them sat around a small bonfire in the backyard. The flames crackled, their warmth reaching out to the circle of blankets and folding chairs they'd set up. Ethan's face glowed with excitement as he roasted marshmallows, sticky hands reaching out for help from his parents. Sarah and Alexander exchanged a smile as they leaned in to help, their hands brushing in the process. The touch, brief but electric, sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "I remember the first bonfire we went to," Alexander said, his voice softer than the night around them. "It was on the beach, and you wore that oversized sweater you said made you look like a cloud." Sarah laughed despite herself, the memory blooming in her mind with vivid detail. She could almost feel the sand between her toes and the wind tangling in her hair. "You kept trying to convince me to dance, but I was too embarrassed. And when you finally did, we both ended up tripping over each other and falling in the sand," Alexander said, his smile broadening. Ethan looked up at them, curious and wide-eyed. "Did Mama fall?" "She did," Alexander said, a hint of playfulness in his tone, "but she got right back up and laughed about it, like she always does." The conversation fell into a comfortable silence as they watched the fire, the only sounds the crackling of wood and the distant hum of the sea. Sarah glanced at Alexander, who was staring into the flames, lost in thought. The lines on his face were more pronounced now, traces of the battles he had fought internally and externally. But there was a softness to him that hadn't been there before, a quiet humility that made her chest ache with a strange, unfamiliar hope. As the fire began to die down and the chill of the evening deepened, Ethan's eyes drooped and he leaned against Sarah, drifting into sleep. Alexander stood, taking the sleeping boy from her arms with a gentleness that caught her off guard. He cradled Ethan close as they walked into the house, the sight of father and son together stirring emotions Sarah had kept buried for too long. Once Ethan was tucked into bed, Alexander lingered in the doorway of the small room, watching his son breathe peacefully. He turned to Sarah, who stood beside him, their shoulders brushing. "Thank you for letting me be part of his life," Alexander said, his voice low and sincere. "It means more than I can ever say." Sarah looked at him, taking in the man who had once shattered her heart and was now working so hard to piece it back together. "It's not just about him, Alexander. I realized that forgiving you was never just for your sake. It was for mine too. Carrying that pain, it was eating away at me." A silence settled over them, heavy with meaning. Then, without thinking, Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Alexander's eyes searched hers, and for the first time, she saw hope reflected there. Hope for something more than just shared parenthood, for a future that might one day be rebuilt, stronger than before. The following morning, the air was crisp, the sun casting long, golden rays over the sleepy town. Alexander joined Sarah and Ethan on a walk by the shore. The water lapped gently at the sand, and seagulls called out as they darted across the sky. Ethan ran ahead, giggling as the cool waves kissed his feet. Sarah and Alexander walked side by side, the silence between them no longer filled with unspoken pain but with possibility. "Where do we go from here?" Alexander asked, his voice hopeful but tentative. Sarah turned to him, the wind catching a strand of her hair. She reached up to tuck it behind her ear, a soft smile playing on her lips. "We take it one day at a time." Alexander nodded, understanding that there were no guarantees, only the promise of effort and the hope that it would be enough. As the sun climbed higher, casting its warm light over them, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt less daunting. Together, they watched Ethan chase the waves, his laughter ringing out over the shore, a sound that spoke of new beginnings. And as they stood there, side by side, the future seemed brighter, a canvas waiting to be painted with second chances and the resilient hues of forgiveness and love. If you liked, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us using the thanks button. Until next time.